It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted that Jon could be here with us. I spent the last 3 or 4 months reading everything Richard Ford has ever written. He has more books than I imagined. There are books about Richard Ford. There are even books about interviews with Richard Ford, and I've read them all. So when he emailed us yesterday and said, I'm stuck in Portland at the airport, I've been there for 9 hours, I'm going home, I thought, great. So, but we will do it again. I have loved every moment of my time reading about and spending time with Richard. He wrote me the loveliest email this morning, regretting that he could not be here, very sorry that he couldn't, and special thanks to Jon for agreeing to step in and be here for this time. So we'll get Richard maybe next year. And he sends his best. Jon,
I'm here to talk about Gerald Ford.
Well, we could do that too.
That's the way you sold this last night.
You said you would answer all these Richard Ford questions.
That's right, yeah.
So I'm supposed to introduce you.
Good.
Very
I think
good.
that's right.
Well, let's see.
And rightly.
Jon grew up in Chattanooga, found his way at the Macaulay School, and then in 1987 enrolled at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. And that happened to be the same year that I went to Sewanee as the Dean of Men. So our lives were forever inextricably connected with me as the Dean of Men and Jon and some of his pals as my first group of students at Sewanee. We may get into that.
Are we off the record? Is this being filmed? Is this being? I did not bring legal counsel.
I remind Jon that I've kept my records from those times. So if he starts misbehaving or getting out of line, he knows that what I've got in store. Loved getting to know Jon as an undergraduate. It was my privilege when he was applying to graduate schools as a senior to write a letter of recommendation for him. And I wrote in that letter of recommendation that Jon then was really one of the most courageous young men I'd ever known. And I referenced the word courage. I used the reference in Plato's Republic, where at the time courage was thought of more as military valor and heroism. But instead, it's really about the courage of one's convictions, And this is what I wrote from Plato's
Who
Republic.
keeps things like this? This is terrifying.
Okay, this is a nice thing now.
This is terrifying.
Courage, quoting Plato, is a certain kind of preserving. The preserving of opinion and not casting it out in pains and pleasures and desires and fears. It's like a color-fast dye, says Plato, that cannot be washed away by those lies and soaps so terribly effective at scouring. And that's what I saw in Jon then, and that's what I have continued to see in Jon for the last 25 years now. Holy smokes. I appreciate the fact he is a very courageous voice on our political landscape, and his work that we all know and the things that he writes about and talks about and encourages us to think about are deeply important. So it's a privilege to be with Jon here. He's currently is editor at Random House. He's a biographer, doing a lot of writing, as you know, and he's also teaching both at Vanderbilt and at Sewanee, so we may hear a little bit about that too. Jon and his wife Keith, who grew up in Jackson and went to St. Andrews, they have 3 children, Sam, Mary, and Maggie, 14, 8, and 5, is that right?
14, 12. Although she stopped smoking this year. We're excited about that. And 8, yeah.
It's a wonderful family. And I appreciate Keith's encouraging me when Phoebe and I were thinking about coming to Jackson. She had a lot to do with us coming here, and we will be.
It was a nightmare. I'll tell that story in a second.
No, we won't.
I have several different,
Anyhow, we need to get on with this, but I do have to tell one funny story about Jon. Okay, so number of years ago, when I was vice president for University Relations at Sewanee, and Jon was working on maybe Jefferson, maybe Jackson, I don't know which one it was.
Right.
Whatever the difference is.
One of them. A dead white man.
He came to my office and said, I need to do some printing this weekend, work on this book. I need to print some things out. So I gave him a key to my office and said, feel free to use this and just keep it anytime you need it. So I didn't see him during the weekend. I came in on Monday morning, and there were these wrappers from the sheaves of paper, like 5 or 6 of the wrappers from these things with 100 or 200 pages in each one.
It was a long book.
It was a long book.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my gosh, she really, sort of went to town with our printing. But then as it got closed, I picked up these wrappers, and it was those wrappers from like that glossy color paper that you use for photography. And they're about $5 a page. And he went through about 5 sheets of these things. Do you remember this?
No.
Yeah, well,
Maybe.
So it was a fun thing to see. I'm just a privilege.
My annual fund gift had to go up that year. So.
So anyway, okay. One last thing. You should know this. We're going to talk mostly about the new Bush book, which is just fantastic. But I want to remind you all about the first book that he says the best book he ever copied? Or
ever Xeroxed, yeah.
Ever Xeroxed. If you don't know this book, you should. Voices in Our Blood, 2001. It's a series of, it's a literary anthology with writers James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Ralph Ellison, William Faulkner, John Steinbeck, Alice Walker, Robert Penn Warren, Eudora Welty, Richard Wright, Willie Morris, an incredible collection of stories about the civil rights, interpretations, stories about helping us understand. I think this is the best book he's done. And I would.
That's because I didn't write it. So thank you, Rob.
If you haven't seen this one, I really encourage you to take a look at that one. That's a great book. So thank you.
Thank you.
John, congratulations on your latest.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
On President Bush. Many of us have read it and inspired by this. We probably wonder as much as anything, how would you, a writer, journalist, historian, scholar, teacher, whatever you are, how would you gain access to someone like that to be able to come up with his diaries, his wife's diaries, access to his family? I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary thing. How did that come about?
President Bush Sr. Did what is unprecedented in modern presidential biography. He gave me everything. He kept an audio diary through most of his career, actually, but as president in particular, once, twice, 3 times a week. And so he dictated into a tape recorder. And as you all will remember, it is a little bit like listening to Dana Carvey, if Dana Carvey were president. And actually, at one point, when I was fact-checking the book, I had an occasion, I was in Sewanee, actually, and in the course of a single hour, one day last summer, I spoke to Henry Kissinger, Dick Cheney, and Dana Carvey. And I wanted to talk to Carvey about how he had created that famous impression. And he said that the key to doing George H.W. Bush is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne, which is totally perfect. It's like, not gonna do it, deaf. So I spent a lot of time around these people. So that was a remarkable thing there. I met President Bush in 1997, and as Rob will testify, because he was there, I was an undergraduate through most of President Bush's term. And my best friend at Sewanee was a man, y'all may have met him, from Moore County, Tennessee. His name is Jack Daniels. And so I was a little fuzzy on some of the big events. I thought the Gulf War was about Destin. And so I had a very cliched view of President Bush going into the late 1990s. And then I met him. And it was at Walker's Point in Maine. I was up there with my friend Michael Beschloss, the historian, to interview President Bush and General Scowcroft on a book they had done about the end of the Cold War. And within 20, 25 minutes or so, I suddenly understood how this man had become president of the United States, how people had decided to trust him with ultimate authority in a nuclear age. And it was because he possesses a quiet, persistent charisma. Now, charisma is not a word you associate with George H.W. Bush. We think of Bill Clinton with charisma for good and for ill. We think of President Kennedy's charisma. We think of Ronald Reagan's charisma. You don't think of George H.W. Bush as a charismatic figure. It used to be said that George Bush reminded every woman of her first husband. But it's not as a first husband. I appreciate that. It's not true. If you meet him, he has that remarkable capacity of being charming. According to the old definition of charm, that charm is the capacity to make other people love you without their quite knowing why. And that's a great gift. And he had this throughout his life. Born in Milton, Massachusetts, June 1924, moved to Greenwich shortly thereafter. Youngest pilot in the Navy, signed up, wanted to join the Royal Canadian Air Force when he was 17, right after Pearl Harbor, because you could get into the British Armed Forces ahead of the American ones. Decided not to do that, waited till his commencement. So on June 12th, 1942, three things happened. He turned 18, he graduated from Phillips Andover Academy in Massachusetts, and he drove to Boston and took his oath as a naval enlistee in the United States Navy. His father didn't want him to do it. His headmaster didn't want him to do it. Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, didn't want people coming right out of high school right then to do it. They knew the war was going to take a while. They wanted them to get a year or two of college. He was determined to do it. It was his first great independent decision. And it really characterized his life. He was a driven man and followed that ambition, always tempered by a sense of empathy and humility. But that contradiction, which is evident when you meet him, most presidents, I've been lucky enough because of what I've done professionally I've interviewed Lady Bird Johnson, Gerald Ford, Mrs. Ford, President and Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Reagan. I never met President Reagan. The Bushes, the Clintons, the Bushes, and the Obamas. All of those folks, particularly the former presidents, if you make a remark about the weather, they will, within 7.5 seconds, that's the count, bring it back to what the weather was like when they were president. It is incredible. It's the solipsism of power. And it's sort of sweet in a way. It's like, well, yeah, the weather was better when I was, George Herbert Walker Bush, you have to take a squash racket and beat him about the head to get him to acknowledge that he was ever president, even when he was in his late 70s and early 80s. And today it's the same way. I was with him 2 weeks ago. Actually, he waited about a year after the publication of the book and has now been having an aide read him the book. And so I happened to be up there, and so he asked if I would read for a day or two, which was totally fascinating.
How did he respond? What was that like?
Well, he didn't say wrong, which was my great fear, or who the hell are you talking about? He said, he's very quiet now. He has a form of Parkinson's. He's in a wheelchair, been in a wheelchair since 2012, but very much with it cognitively. At the end of the reading, which was the fall of the This Will Not Stand, the beginning of the Gulf War, and the Newt Rebellion. Actually, the only thing he said was when I got to Newt, he went, "Oh God, Newt." So some things don't change. We finished, and I said, "Mr. President, how much of this do you remember?" And it was very sweet. He said, "Very little." He said, it's as if it happened to someone else, but hearing it brings it all back. So it was fascinating. So it was meeting him, and then I think he gave it to me, or he was going to give it to somebody, because my sense of the Bushes is they are totally confident that they did the best they could when they had power. They got some things right, some things wrong, and they believe that a fair-minded assessment will bear that out. And I think it does.
So, but he turned over his diaries? He
did.
And Barbara's?
Well, Mrs. Bush's was even more complicated. Mrs. Bush kept a diary from 1948 forward, unto this hour. She got up at 5 o'clock this morning and wrote in her diary. And it's an amazing document, box upon box upon box. And when President Bush 43 was told by me somehow, because they're wasps, but they don't talk to each other. So it's all in direction. They talk about vodka or gin, but other than that, it's. I said, Mr. President, your mother gave me her diary. He went, well, She gave you what? That's not good for me. Again, I spent a lot of time with these people. And it was fascinating. The only restriction on the whole project was President Bush didn't care. President Bush gave me everything, said, go do it, read it when it's done. Mrs. Bush, because it is more of a personal document, wanted me to clear any quotation with her before we publish, because there's so much family stuff in it. And not context, not what I did with it, but her actual words. And I took her 90 pages of excerpts down to Houston one day, and she read it. About halfway through, she said, I was an opinionated 37-year-old. I was like, things don't change much, ma'am. And then she took nothing off the record. So functionally, there was no constraint.
Well, now, I remember when you started this project, I think you thought you had to wait until he had passed away. So when did he change his mind and say, go ahead and publish this?
Well, he won't die.
Well, there's that.
He used to say, publish it when I'm paws up. And then at another point he said, publish it when I'm at the men's grill in the sky. Basically what happened was, we forget to some extent how complicating for him his son's presidency was. Remember, President Bush Sr. really went into hibernation during the son's presidency because he believed firmly that anything he said in public would be parsed to beat 43 about the head. So if there was any difference between what he said and what the administration was doing. So he just refused to comment publicly and largely privately too on anything that was going on. And so when we got to 2009, I was working on Jefferson. And what I would do is I would go down, I'd have to go up to Maine or down to Houston a couple of times a year and just do an interview and keep going, put it in the drawer. In about 2012, when I finished the Jefferson book, I had to do something. And so I realized at that point we were 4 years out from George W.'s presidency. We were going to be 25 out from his. We are now as far from the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush as he was from President Kennedy and President Johnson, if you want to feel old. So I went to him and just said, I think I can do this in a way that it will not be any different than if you were gone. And he was totally fine with it.
What about the rest of the family?
Well, we mentioned 43. He was very skeptical at first. He'll tell you that at some length. I'd been at Newsweek for a long time. The relations between the Republic of Bush and the Republic of Newsweek were not always what they ought to have been. And so the younger President Bush worried, A, about what I might say about his father, and B, what I might say about his administration, given the journalistic culture from whence I came. And finally, we spent so much time together. There was one afternoon in Dallas where we spent about 4.5 hours together. And at about hour 3, I realized he wasn't going to get up until I got up. So by God, I wasn't going to get up. And so we sat there and sat there and sat there. And his chief of staff, I found out later, was emailing 41's chief of staff saying, they're still there. Should I send in the agents? But it was actually it was fascinating. And what I find as a biographer is that the more you talk to someone, the more you contemplate something, the more complex it is, the more nuanced it is. And what's incumbent on me as a biographer as opposed to a journalist is to not render hasty opinions. And so ultimately the family was, again, confident that it would be fair. They don't love every word.
What have they taken most exception to, would you say?
Well, the biggest issue, I think, is, in my view, the interesting thing about this man is he is a consummate political creature. now he seems this remarkable wise man and statesman. And it is true. I mean, we've gone in 25 years from a Republican president who could not talk about himself to a Republican nominee who, I don't even need to finish the joke. It reminds me of what Henry Adams said about the movement from Washington to Grant disproved Darwin. So I think that's kind of where we are with him. But if you go back in real time, he is this remarkably driven figure. I asked him once, because when you ask him in passing, you say, why did you go into politics? What drove you? He'd say, service. And I'd heard that a lot. And I finally said, Mr. President, all respect, I said, if it were only about service, you could have opened a soup kitchen. But you sought nuclear power. What was that about? And that was in the morning, one morning. And he waved me off, and we went on to other things. That afternoon, 6 hours later, we were sitting around his living room. We'd been in his office. And without any reference to the previous question, he looked up and said, it's big left hand, he's left-handed, be number one, be the captain of the team, be the head of whatever you want to be the head of, goal, motivation, be number one. And then he just put his fist down. And what had happened was, like a pinball machine, the question had been bouncing around in his head. And that was the most, again, I've talked to a lot of these people and read a lot about them. That was the most candid admission of a politician's ambition that I'd ever heard. And this is coming from a man, again, who's at a very difficult time, an ambivalent relationship with the first person pronoun. Remember, his speechwriters used to take out the first person pronoun. So they would say things like, moved to Texas, started a business, went into politics. Because when he saw I, he would hear his mother's voice, his mother whom Rob met. And she was always enforcing on these children a sense of both competitiveness and of humility. And so she would want you to go out. It was an ambient relationship, atmosphere. Go out, go win the tennis match, go be number one, be the best boy at the school, whatever it is. But when you came home and she said, how did it go? And if George would say, I scored 2 goals in the soccer game, she would say, I didn't ask you that. I asked how the team did. And so he was always, I think one of the reasons he was inarticulate is he was always hearing his mother's voice saying, don't talk about yourself, while he was fulfilling the dictates, on the other hand, of always go out and be number one. And so I think his psychology was divided there. And what he did, therefore, as a politician, is he would do almost anything to win power. He opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is a very uncomfortable thing to talk about in 2016, but he did. So did Barry Goldwater, but the nominee of his party. But when Bush was running for the Senate in Texas, he opposed it. But what does he do in 1968? He's in the House from Houston. Fair housing comes up. And against the will of his constituents in the 7th District of Texas, which was as silk-stocking a district as you could get, he voted for open housing. He came down to Memorial High School over in Houston to a ferocious constituent meeting, people hurling racial epithets at him, outraged. And he quoted Edmund Burke, who said that a representative does not simply owe you the reflection of your will, but his best judgment. And my best judgment is you cannot ask African Americans to go fight in Vietnam and then tell them there are certain neighborhoods they cannot live in at home. And he turned it like that. So he had done the wrong thing in the search for power, but did the right thing once he had it. Same in 1988. Very tough campaign. It will not be studied at the League of Women Voters or PBS for high-minded civic campaigning. But what does he do the moment he gets to Washington? He tries to create a culture of compromise and consensus. The last one who tried to create that culture. And so those are 2 examples where he would do what it took to get there. But once he got there, I think what redeemed him is that he tried to do the right thing.
Interesting. You mentioned his mom. We've got a reference in here to a letter that he wrote to her with his life code.
Yeah.
Quote, tell the truth. Don't blame people. Be strong. Do your best. Try hard. Forgive. Stay the course.
That's it. That's Dorothy Walker Bush, who was, the Bush and Walker families are fascinating. They're both Midwestern fortunes, Gilded Age fortunes. G.H. Walker ran a huge dry goods empire. His father ran a huge dry goods empire. Then he became a big investment guy. The Bushes ran Buckeye Steel in Ohio and then came east. He used to joke with President Reagan, who'd had a rough time during the Depression as a child. President Reagan's father was an alcoholic shoe salesman and had a hard time keeping a job. And Bush would say, well, you're right, Mr. President. During the Depression, we had to reuse tennis balls. But he was sort of, but his view was, and it's an interesting point. He used to, when people would say he was rich and out of touch, he would say, why is it that if you're rich and you're a Democrat, that's okay? If you're if you're a Harriman or a Kennedy, that's all right. If you're rich and you're a Republican, you're automatically suspect.
So what about his three siblings? Jonathan, Prescott, and Nancy.
Four. And Bucky.
Okay, yeah. Were they the same? Did they have?
Well, Poppy, he was called Poppy, much to his embarrassment sometimes. Although it's funny, in the family, Mrs. Bush still occasionally slips and calls him Pop or Poppy. It was his childhood nickname. He was the second son, interestingly. So here's the star of the family, who's the second son. That's partly because Prescott Bush, his older brother, had a birth defect, had an eye injury, and so he wasn't as good in sports, which was a central part of the Victorian muscular Christianity ethos of the Bushes. Then George comes along, and he was born, Jonathan had a great line, John Bush, who's now a stockbroker in New Haven. He said that the thing about Pop is he was born with an innate empathy. His childhood nickname was Have-Half, because whenever he had a candy bar or a treat, he would split it in half and give half to the other kid. I would argue there's a direct line between that character and the man who ended the Cold War, because he understood how the other guy felt. That's a big Bush phrase. You always want to think about the other guy. So the wall comes down on the 8th, 9th of November, 1989. Gorbachev is trying to manage the swirling forces of reform. George Mitchell, Dick Gephardt, the Democrats are pushing Bush from the left. The Cold Warriors are pushing him from the right to fly to Berlin and make a dramatic statement about the end of the Cold War. He refuses because he understood what Gorbachev was feeling. And as he put it, if I was going to go stick it in his ear, he meant I, but that's our boy. Not going to stick it in his ear. Then that was going to complicate the important diplomacy that had to unfold. And, we all argue sometimes, do we spend too much time on the character of presidents and the character of politicians? No, we don't. Remember, the presidential office itself was created in part because of the character of George Washington. There were a lot of anti-federalists and lukewarm federalists who were on the fence about the concentration of executive power and the uncertainty of how that office might develop. And they subsumed those worries and supported the Constitution in large measure because they knew George Washington was going to be the first president. And they trusted his character to smooth out the rougher edges. And so the Greeks were right, character is destiny, and I think that's no more totally clear in the case of Bush.
Interesting. What about his father? Now, I've had an opportunity to meet his sister once, and she remembered an instance when, I think it was in the New Hampshire debates, when Reagan showed up and...
Nashua.
Okay. Yeah. And Bush he said, I paid for this microphone and, you can't take, and his sister said, boy, the shadow of my father was all over that.
Yeah, it was. That was a critical moment. Remember, in 1980, Bush, just to run through this quickly, so he runs for the Senate he moves to Texas after the war. 1948, they moved to Odessa from Yale. Barbara Bush, who had grown up in Rye, New York, her mother would send her boxes of soap and laundry detergent because she didn't think they had that in Texas. And in Odessa, it's probably a close call. There may be Texans here, sorry, but you look very clean, ma'am. That's good. It's okay. I'm sure it's been a tough year. If it weren't for Tennessee, y'all would still be part of Spain. I told George W. Bush that once. He went, and then I got audited for 8 years. I'm sure there was no connection. He built an international business, offshore oil business, moves to Houston in 59. He runs for the Senate in 64 against Ralph Yarborough, loses that, runs for the House, 2 terms in the House. Then he loses the Senate in 70 to Lloyd Bentsen. He becomes ambassador to the United Nations, then chairman of the Republican National Committee during Watergate. What second prize? That's good. Then he goes to China as envoy, comes back and runs the CIA for a year, and then goes back to Houston, immediately starts running for president, and wins the Iowa caucus, beat Ronald Reagan in 1980 in the Iowa caucus, and had what he famously referred to as the Big Mo, which sounded like a Yale cheerleader who'd had too much caffeine. And Reagan, it sort of woke him up. He'd been running this front-runner strategy. And Reagan fired his shades of something, got rid of his campaign team and started anew. And they went into that debate in New Hampshire, and it's a famous moment. Reagan and Bush thought Bush thought it was going to be Reagan versus Bush as a clear 2-man race. Crowded field. Ronald Reagan, George Bush, John Connally, Bob Dole, Howard Baker, Phil Crane, John Anderson. Significant people. And Reagan is paying for the debate. They sit down. Reagan has decided to ambush, so to speak, Bush, and bring the other candidates just to rattle him. And it's a fascinating moment because every instinct in half Bush's body would have been, sit down, guys, sure. Sit down. But he froze in many ways. And what Nancy Ellis is, his sister, who is sort of Katharine Hepburn-like, her view is that their father, Senator Prescott Bush, was a huge stickler for rules. No one understood the USGA code better than Prescott Bush. Just if there was a rule, you followed it. And Bush had in his head that the rules it was the two of them. And so he looks, as William Loeb, the notoriously right-wing editor of the New Hampshire, of the Manchester Union leader, later wrote that Bush looked as if he'd been dropped off at the wrong birthday party. And Reagan, and the moderator says, turn off Governor Reagan's microphone. And Reagan, borrowing a line from Spencer Tracy in the movie from 1948, I think, State of the Union, grabs the microphone and says, Mr. Green, I'm paying for this microphone. It's a classic Reagan moment. 1, it was a line from a movie. 2, the guy's name wasn't Green. But again, classic Reagan, it didn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
It's like the Bible, it was true but not accurate. I have to come to Mississippi to use these jokes.
Everybody write that one down. You're gonna hear it again.
Yeah, the method, anyway. So it was his father, and he wrote this amazing letter to all of them saying, I'm so sorry, and he never did it again. That was the kind of, it was a damn miracle he became president. You look back at this resume and what I just laid out, and it's a golden resume. But there were all these moments where it could have gone the other way. The 1980 Republican Convention. We thought that, this year's was kind of crazy. Ronald Reagan was the putative nominee of the Republican Party, comes into Detroit on Monday and doesn't have a running mate. And he decides, after having a quick meeting with Gerald Ford, the former president, that he wants to put Ford on the ticket. And it begins this 36 hours of feverish negotiations trying to redefine the scope of the presidency in a bunch of hotel suites in Detroit. And it fell apart finally.
And wasn't there some discussion about Kissinger being sort of a...
Henry, as ever, was involved.
Yeah.
Kissinger and Greenspan, Alan Greenspan, who'd been in the Ford administration, the idea was that Kissinger would become Secretary of State again, which, of course, if you know anything about Reagan's foreign policy and what brought him to that place, was totally out of the question. Reagan had defined movement conservatism against Kissinger. There had been resolutions at the 1976 convention against Kissinger. So it fell apart. But at the very last minute, Ronald Reagan did not call George H.W. Bush to offer him the vice presidency until 11:32 p.m. on the night of July 17th, 1980, Wednesday night. The next day was his acceptance speech. So Reagan's view was he couldn't let the negotiations go into Thursday because it would step on his speech. The showman's sense of timing was there. And both President Bush 41 and President Bush 43 have acknowledged in conversations with me that neither one of them would have been president if Reagan had not made that phone call.
Interesting. How about that? Oh. Well, now, you mentioned in the book and this vision thing that he also was accused of not really having much of a vision. And I think he came up with this.
He did.
But he seems to think he had a pretty clear sense of what the future, what success looked like in the future.
He had this it was very touching in a way. He hated that. In fact, he's the one who came up with the phrase, the vision thing. And he was like, oh God, the vision thing again. His view ultimately was, and it's there, is he said, what's wrong with trying to help people? What's wrong with trying to make the world a little more orderly, a little more peaceful? You know, what's wrong with trying to create a little more prosperity? You know, he resisted sound bites to his detriment. You know, the Sermon on the Mount was full of sound bites. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall was a sound bite. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country was a sound bite. They are valuable political weapons. You know, he's remembered for saying, read my lips, which he then broke, and hating broccoli, you know, which endears him, by the way, to my children. My 8-year-old, who was 5 when I started doing the full-time work on this book, or 4, was a little confused by my shifting interests between the founding fathers and George Bush. Her teacher asked her one day in kindergarten, what's your daddy writing about? And she said, he's writing a biography of George Jefferson. So we're working on that. You know, there's a lot of online tutoring tools now. But he really thought, he was a
thought he had a vision.
He's an American Tory, basically. And he's the last American politician of what I would call the Eisenhower consensus, that there's a center-right place to be, that if a large government program becomes part of the fabric of the country, you don't rip it up. Remember, movement conservatism began, in large measure, out of disappointment with Eisenhower in 53, 54, because conservatives, Bill Buckley among them, had expected the first Republican president since 1932, 20-year of one-party rule, 32 to 52, Roosevelt Truman, expected Eisenhower to rip up the New Deal and the Fair Deal. And Eisenhower was a more conservative in the classic sense of that. George Bush was an Eisenhower Republican. He was the last one. Ronald Reagan was not an Eisenhower Republican. Reagan was in many ways a radical. He was a reformer. He wanted to push things in a certain direction. Bush wanted to manage things. He was about managing change, and as he often said, keeping bad things from happening. And I would argue that we are all in a stronger, better world because his management of the end of the Cold War was largely about keeping the worst from happening. And that I think we were incredibly lucky as a country to have President Reagan for 8 years and President Bush for 4, because President Reagan did things in the Cold War context that President Bush could never have done. President Bush could never have used the evil empire. He could never have sort of run that level of rhetorical negotiation. And frankly, President Reagan would not have been as good at managing the minutia of the reunification of Germany, which is one of the, if you ask President Bush, even today, what are you proudest of? He says the reunification of Germany. Let me tell you what biographers don't want to hear. It's something as exciting as the reunification of Germany. It's like, oh, Jesus, you know. But when you think about it, he undid 40 years creating this powerhouse in the heart of Europe, and did it in a way that very few people in this room, as learned and as literate as you all are, can really walk me through the reunification of Germany. I just wrote about it and I can't do it. So he was an American Tory in many ways.
So what's the view from Kennebunkport these days? What's their sense of how things look on the political horizon?
Well,
You were just with them.
I was just with them, that's true. Yeah, there have been more cheerful seasons. You know, the lobsters are still boiling, and that's just, you know, when they start talking. No, they don't, you know, Governor Bush, I think they, like a lot of us, were totally taken aback by the Trump tsunami. They were very supportive, enthusiastic, you know, obviously wanted their son to do well. I reject, by the way, the idea that Jeb was supposed to be president and George W. wasn't. When you climb back inside their lives, that's not borne out. It's a piece of conventional narrative that's not actually true.
So how did that fall apart?
The
Jeb's.
the campaign. Well, I mean, we're living in a country right now where 81% of the people do not trust the government to do the right thing some or most of the time. 73% believe the country's headed in the wrong direction. 60% believe that the country's going to be in worse shape for their children than it was for them. There's not a single piece of social science data that suggests optimism about the future. So you translate that to, you know, also you have stagnant real wages over the last 25, 26 years. So you look at an economic climate where a significant portion of the American public is either stagnant or losing ground, and you look at a political culture that seems not to shift significantly or significantly enough to affect those economic fortunes, no matter who's in charge. And if your name is Jeb Bush, it's hard to run as a reformer. It's hard to run as a convincing agent of change when either your grandfather, your father, or your brother has been in the Senate, the vice presidency, or the presidency for much of the 20th century, and for the first 8 years of the 21st. So I think that was it. I think Governor Bush was a candidate for a calmer, less populist year. And, you know, the Bushes had experience with this, let's be clear. I mean, Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. If Trump and Perot rhymed, that would be, you know, they've been to the movie where a populist billionaire uses a new method of communication. Ross Perot would not have gotten 19% without Larry King, without CNN. Larry King was the Twitter of 1992. So he mastered the means of different communication. He talked around the establishment, and you know, you had three things happened actually in that period that we're still living with. One was the rise of reflexive partisanship. The reason for that line, "Oh God, Newt," was because Newt decided to oppose a Republican president on his tax deal, on his budget deal, because Newt believed it was more important to keep faith with his increasingly conservative populist base than it was to support his president. And so he walked out of the White House through the front door while Bush and the congressional leadership were going out to the Rose Garden to announce that deal in October of 1990. That was one. Second was this rise of alternative communications, cable, and the rise of political talk shows. CNN and the other cable outlets were adding talk shows in the 89 to 92. Rush Limbaugh didn't really become a national force until 1989, which was the year, Bush's first year as president. He became so important that his endorsement of Pat Buchanan in the 1992 primaries was hugely important. And the third thing that happened, and again, it's amazing that all the same characters are here, is Bill Clinton was really an architect of what I think of as confessional politics, someone who emoted publicly. George H.W. Bush is one of the most emotional men I've ever known. He has cried in my presence. I have cried in his presence far more than I have with anyone I'm related to, which may say more about me and my Episcopalianism than I want. But he cried. In fact, we should end with that in a second. He's incredibly dignified. He did not believe, he did feel people's pain. He just didn't think a president was supposed to show it. And there's a scene in 1987. He's in Krakow as vice president. And the Bushes lost a daughter to leukemia in 1953. And he walks into a children's leukemia ward as vice president and realizes where he is. And he's standing there, and all the cameras and reporters are at his back. And he begins to cry. And he won't turn around, because if he turns around, the story becomes about him and not about them. I know a lot of politicians, a lot of good and noble men and women. Not a single one of them besides George H.W. Bush do I think would have failed to turn around and make that a moment. And Clinton understood, incredibly, understood the rise of cable in the way that Trump understands the rise of Twitter. He went on Arsenio Hall. George Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Andover. He had no idea. We took Spanish there.
So writing a biography.
I'm going to steal this from you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Writing a biography, especially when you have such close access to the person and the family, I think it would be hard for it not to feel more like an autobiography. How did
Yeah.
you, and yours doesn't, and I think you should be commended for
I appreciate that.
insightful and honest, but very
I appreciate that. It is hard, and what was really hard was, everyone else I've written about has been long dead and mostly vilified. If I write about you, you're probably gonna get thrown off the currency, the way things are going. So I wrote about Andrew Jackson, a genocidal maniac with a heart of gold.
Hey, remember, you're in Jackson.
Oh, sorry,
Be
yeah,
careful.
great town.
Don't forget.
I didn't say the town was. I spent a lot of time with the old Hickory. But because I was coming in in the middle of or at the end of a long scholarly conversation with those books. With this, I was the first person to go through the material in many ways, in many cases. And so it was a slightly different historical project, because if I didn't put a lot of this on the record, it would stay in the library. And so every once in a while, I would let him take over the narrative, because my historical judgment was, if you can listen to what it's like to be president from that president, not years later when he's trying to spin it, but when he's exhausted, when he's sitting there belly aching about the press, or talking about Gorbachev, or saying, why doesn't anyone care about Bill Clinton's draft record? It's very honest, very raw. I have to tell you one Clinton story. So as you know, they're in sort of a Brokeback Mountain meets C-SPAN thing. And so they love each other now. And are we okay on time?
I have no idea.
Are we okay?
Nobody
okay.
told me what time.
This is worth
okay,
it.
I didn't know. Sorry.
This is worth it. So, and it's George W. Bush's fault that Clinton and his father became such good friends, because when the tsunami happened at Christmas 04 or 05, he asked his father and President Clinton to lead the relief efforts. And so they were going to, I have this story bear with me. This is from Clinton, and both Bushes have basically affirmed the key elements here. So according to protocol, when you're in Washington, the president really always travels alone to wherever you're going, even with former presidents. So they're going to the Indonesian consulate to sign the Book of Remembrance before Clinton and 41 go off to the site, go off across the Pacific. And 43 is going to join them for this visit to the consulate. So they drive up, 41 and Clinton get out of the car, they go into the lobby, and the consul general from Indonesia meets them. And there are these beautiful paintings on the wall. And Clinton says, "Tell me, who painted that?" And the consulate said, "Oh, that is our great painter Umbunga," whatever it was. And Clinton said, "That's great." And they go upstairs. Meanwhile, 43 has arrived. He walks in. His two predecessors are coming down the stairs. Clinton grabs him by the arm and says, "George, these are my favorite Umbungas ever. I have followed his work for years." And 41's like, "No wonder I lost to this guy." They are.
What's next? What are you working on?
I'm doing James Madison with Dolly.
Dolly, okay.
She sexes it up,
Okay.
thank God. It's a tough literary task. He did everything he could to be uninteresting. But I'm gonna try. My view is, if you write the Constitution, if you're a two-term war president, and if you drive the opposition party out of business, you deserve to be better remembered.
Yeah, good.
Those are my tests. I want to read this to you if I could, because you all are sweet to listen to me talk about George H.W. Bush. And I know that it's not, I had a lot of people say, is there enough there? He's a one-term president, Dana Carvey. I think this is one of the more important American lives of our time. And I think one of the great things about his living so long, although if he keeps jumping out of airplanes, that might end, is that he's been able to see this shift. He only got 37% in 1992. So 2/3 of the country wanted him gone. And one of the things I wanted to do here was to humanize this man who could seem sort of aloof, could seem too patrician. And I want to read you an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to his mother about the loss of their daughter, Robin. The Bushes, at that point, George W. had been born in 46. Robin was born in 49. This is early 1953. She's feeling sluggish. She's bruising. They take her to the pediatrician in Midland. Neither Bush had ever heard the word leukemia before they were told the diagnosis in the doctor's office. They took her to Sloan Kettering. She survived about 6 months, died over the Columbus Day weekend in 1953. This letter was written about 5 years after that, after Neil had been born, after Marvin had been born, Jeb had been born. So there were 4 boys, but still no girl. And Dora was born then in 59. But this is the man I got to know. There is about our house a need, the running, pulsating restlessness of the 4 boys as they struggle to learn and grow. The world embraces them. All this wonder needs a counterpart. We need some starched crisp frocks to go with all our torn-kneed blue jeans and helmets. We need some soft blonde hair to offset those crew cuts. We need a dollhouse to stand firm against our forts and rackets and 1,000 baseball cards. We need a legitimate Christmas angel, one who doesn't have cuffs beneath the dress. We need someone who's afraid of frogs. We need someone to cry when I get mad, not argue. We need a little one who can kiss without leaving egg or jam or gum. We need a girl. We had one once, She'd fight and cry and play and make her way just like all the rest. But there was about her a certain softness. She was patient. Her hugs were just a little less wiggly. She'd stand beside our bed till I felt her there. Silently and comfortable, she'd put those precious fragrant locks against my chest and fall asleep. Her peace made me feel strong and so very important. My daddy had a caress, a certain ownership, which touched a slightly different spot than the hi dad I love so much. But she is still with us. We need her and yet we have her. We can't touch her and yet we can feel her. We hope she'll stay in our house for a long, long time. I asked the president to read that in the course of an interview, and long before he finished, he was sobbing with a remarkable level of physicality. So much so that his chief of staff, whose office was next door, came in, and she realized what was going on, and she said to me, "Why did you want President Bush to read that?" And I said, "Well, if you want to know someone's heart," and before I could finish, the president interrupted and said, "You have to know what breaks it." That's George H.W. Bush.
Thank you, John.